Since you were shooting me, my head doesn't show. I'm going to sit here again.
That's fine. All right.
I'll come down here with donuts. Hey, looks good. And he has the microphone, or?
He doesn't have a microphone, so this should let him look at the audio levels and confirm that we're getting audio. I believe we are. Yeah, we're. So this is picking up.
Okay, good. All right. You what?
My coffee.
Oh,
I must.
yeah, I think I saw it upstairs.
That's fine. Dave, you all set?
Yeah. Are we start? Have you started the stream?
started.
Okay.
It's live.
And I'm here.
Yep, that's the minute.
And I understand basically good health news for you,
Yes.
right?
No. What did they say? No detectable growth.
Can we ask for, well, maybe we can ask for more than that, but it sounds good to me.
With the scan they did, they only can see if it's growing or not growing.
Sure.
I'll have another scan to see if it's shrinking.
Oh, okay, sure. So there are
Yeah.
many ways we can be satisfied, and that would be the next level. then.
Well, the biggest thing was no growth.
Exactly, that's good. May it ever be thus. Good to hear.
That-
You want to sit one and roll up, or you want to sit? You like it where it's warmer? Yeah, but you're right by the person that's running the camera thing.
That's all right.
I don't bite.
How are you doing, David?
Good. And I've had most of my shots. I'm not gonna tell you which one I'm missing.
I said these rooms get cold, don't they? I'm gonna put my phone right here. And
I'm along the front rows, maybe I should move over her, see the screen and all that good stuff.
so is the new year bringing stable health?
Yes, may it ever be thus.
Okay, so Carol, it's in the Amarillo. It's a hit. It's in a perfect room at that point. And now it's done.
Mine was too.
Yeah.
I was gone.
Yes, oh, yeah.
I got back and it was like,
I had it on the food line and I said, what is this? And they'd never seen anything like it. Most of them didn't even know about this red wax thing. Oh my gosh, it was beautiful. Just beautiful. Like 5 minutes.
and you can cut them off and sometimes they'll re-glue.
Oh, you know what? I read that they would have. So should I take it out of the trash and cut that?
No, you can buy it.
Where I looked up the red wax thing, it said they only balloon once.
Well, last year, mine kept having little sprouts, so I don't, I haven't tried it yet this year, but when I go home, I need to do that because I feel my flowers are.
Right, right. So, last time I got sugar all over my pants when I got it, so.
Sugar's pre-melt. How are you?
This is not one we had, you couldn't see it, I
Yeah, and that should be, I ordered it Friday, so it should be here next week.
It comes from California, so it takes a while.
And I have the bottle for you too, so a bottle, champagne, I think it is. It's in the car chilling.
Maybe after church?
Yeah. I mean, the car's down there, so. Okay.
That area is always yellow or orange.
we decided
Well, mine's staying up for another week. Because I got mine up like
we got ours
2 days, yeah, 2 days before Christmas.
We got ours on the 10th or something. So
And then I left.
No, sorry, I was just curious. I had a good
They said, you know, I want to just enjoy this, you know, because I don't know what kept me so busy during December.
very nice.
But it was like, I felt like I was really busy.
anyway,
Oh, are they?
Mine
Well, it was a very,
I'm not just
still very rich. You know what I'm saying?
somehow, I remember last year,
It's the same
I
podcast. I'm not,
just kept it up, and then all of a sudden one day I said, you know, I'm done.
there were times in the past our neighbor has a street already, and I said, it's a little chilly. Well, so it's got down
Somebody left his jacket under a chair. I just go through each room. Oh, okay. Your last chance. I will.
That would be looking forward to it.
enlightened journalists will meet synthetic.
Matthew Capucci always writes these great explanations. Do you read him on those? Matthew Capucci, he's another one who he always writes about it.
This way.
Frequently about his relationships.
But the progress of
Warm and about 25 degrees. I really have to have layers. You know, there's supposed to be, at first it was already advertised. After people bought it, they ended up revising it, because it just wasn't keeping you that warm.
But the thing is, the nice thing about that is you guys say,
I've got like,
I don't have any.
one that was really long, she works which I was understand and take a bus.
I assume you got the boat out of the water.
Lauderdale. I hear their
Yes, but
Sucks.
I went through some radiation treatment and I had a test done on Sunday or Thursday. There was no attainable detectable growth.
So I had an MRI done on my brain for vertigo, and you know the pathology report comes back, and they speak in their medical language. You know, it says no detectable cranial process. I guess my brain's not working.
And I'm gonna take out this.
There's that.
Later, they have a operation.
But the psychology is that if you speak soft,
Nobody hears you.
no, you begin to lean in. If you haven't signed up, I know after they wants folks to sign in there. I'm told that we'll be here for January in this room. And when I'm told this, it's always either as a preface or as an appendix that says, and there will be donuts. So someplace between bribery and temptation. The issue has never been temptation. The issue has always been, of course, yielding to the donuts. So we'll continue with the Hebrew prophets with a little bit of a switch in terms of the topic. The Hebrew prophet has witnessed, which of course, it remains that way. And I want to say again as a reminder, why this particular topic sort of strikes and has a resonance, at least for me, I hope for all of us. No one has ever, to my knowledge, I want to be careful, to my knowledge, no one has ever really come up with a topic that says, okay, here is the definitive topic to describe the role of the prophet. And by the way, anyone who says that, you know, just hang on to your wallet and walk away. But we struggle to find out a little bit. And so the prophets have been called, not surprisingly, they have been called Yahwehs because they focus on the role of Yahweh, what the Lord requires of you, kind of thing. They have been called revolutionaries. They have been called reformers. And to reform, many scholars have argued, is predicated on the idea that there already is something that has gone awry and now we are reconstructing, if you will. They have been called, not surprisingly, ethicists. Because when you read the prophets, with some exceptions to be sure, but when you read the prophets, it's almost impossible not to see the ethical component that is woven through all of them. There are exceptions, of course. Then they have been called messengers. And as I think I've mentioned this before, that's been the topic, or that's been sort of the category that has been most in the forefront of most scholars and thinkers, that the prophets are messengers, that a message was given to the prophet delivered it, and then the prophet returned to wherever, right? But I want to propose that Abraham Heschel, that some of you either have read or heard about, I consider Abraham Heschel one of my teachers. Now, did he ever teach me formally? No. Okay? But his thinking, by the way, in part because he passed away in the 70s, all right? But his thinking, his ideas, his commitment, his scholarship, his language, all of which, if you read him, okay, you will be absolutely struck by how deep, I mean, where this stuff comes from is not only some kind of scholarship where, you know, your eyes hurt after you read or you're not, it comes from the heart if you read him. And in part because of who he was, but also in part because of the environment out of which he came, which was Nazi Germany. And his book, there are many, but his book, in my view, that really is kind of a landmark study, is simply called, it's not fancy, it's simply called The Prophets. Okay? And he talks about the prophet as witness. Elie Wiesel talks about himself as witness. And it's the idea, a witness is the idea of someone who not only delivers a message and simply says, listen, as we have come to use the proverb, this axiom, listen, I'm just a messenger here, all right? In other words, I have no part of this. The prophet had every part of this, okay? And in some instances, as we will discover in the weeks ahead, in the case of Jeremiah, lived through this to see his words actually come true. Now, it's one thing to say, this is what the Lord has called me to say, and I will return. I don't know when this is going to happen, but Jeremiah lived to see it happen. The prophets, therefore, it seems to me, are most notably witnesses. They lived the message. They believed in the message even when it was difficult. A certain Jonah comes to mind, which we will look at in the weeks ahead, okay? The reluctant prophet. So we want to think about this, but the topic that I have suggested for January doesn't show up here, but you might have noticed it in the announcement. Love your enemies, okay? There's nothing fancy about that. We've heard that statement a million times. Love your enemies, okay? That bar is very high. Because our natural impulse is not to love our enemies. Our natural human impulse is to what? Right? Get back. You have hurt me. The human impulse maybe is for revenge, is for creating hurt. And yet, both in the Old Testament and in the teachings of Jesus, all right, the bar is set here, love your enemies. Love those who have set out and have in fact done something to you, if you will, that have caused pain. Or those who are being viewed as the enemy. And again, we will look at some of this in a little bit. So this seems like an odd statement here to begin talking about the prophets. But I'll point that out in a moment. In the handout that you have, you will notice that it begins, comfort, comfort my people. And we've talked about this opening line, which of course we all recognize, and it comes right out of course, the prophet Isaiah. But also we know that line in part because we hear it during right, hand of Messiah, with the tenor, all right? But the context is, of course, a people coming out of exile, a people coming out of bondage, a people returning to, if you will, you're returning to a land, and which, at least for a generation, from which you have been taken, okay? But you're also returning to a place where the temple has been razed to the ground. There is no temple. And there will come a time when that will be, but the prophet is saying, listen, on your return, give comfort to these people. And it's interesting, comfort, oh comfort my people, speak tenderly to Jerusalem and cry to her, she has served her term, paid her penalty, she have received from the Lord's hand double for all of her sins. And then it goes on to talk about a voice crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, right? We know this text. But I want for us to focus just for a second on comfort. And the language of comfort is generally associated with those of us who at different points in our lives are in situations of weakness. That's what the word, of course, means, to give strength with strength. As we know the Latin, as in fort, as in fortress, as in fortitude. That's what it means, all right? And the prophet is saying, when you are coming out of exile, when you are coming out of a state of bondage, when you are coming out of a place of displacement, or what are one of my sort of Old Testament heroes, mentors, Walter Brueggemann, would say, when you have been placed in a state of outlandishment, as in outland, when you are coming home again, despite what Thomas Wolfe says, you can't come home again, okay? But if you're gonna come home again, right, it might very well be that this kind of homecoming will bring with it, by the way, some pain. You're coming back to a place that for some has never been your place because you have been in exile. Okay? But you're also coming home again to the one place where everyone has gathered, the temple, and it's gone. So comfort my people. Comfort them. Give strength to them. And then we get, as we move on, to Isaiah, the third part of Isaiah. And as I've indicated, depending who you're reading, most scholars, okay, I'm always careful here, but most scholars would acknowledge that the book of Isaiah, the 66 chapters, are divided primarily in two major sections. Okay? Some believe it's 3, okay? And there is some argument for that. There are just a handful of folks who believe the book is 1 and that's just the way it is. Okay? These are also the folks who read from Genesis to the book of Revelation, and everything, of course, is literal. But you and I don't do that because we're enlightened. So, because you will not be able to get out of chapter 1 of Genesis before you start raising questions. Okay? But for some, enlightenment has become a casualty. So anyway, that's a different kind of lecture. So Isaiah chapter 58, and you have that, but I'll read a section to you. And once again, it's a reminder. Now, we're not in the Lenten season yet, okay? And we're just talking, Vera and I were just talking about this morning. This year, Lent actually, Ash Wednesday comes very late this year. It begins March. And so Easter Sunday is the 20th of April, unusually late. But as we begin Lent, to think ahead here, right? The language of fasting will emerge for some of us as part of, if you will, the ritual of embracing that period. And so as we think of this particular text from Isaiah, I think it is instructive for us to think about not just fasting, but what exactly does fasting mean? So before we get into the text, let me pose the question. For those of us who fast, okay, and it doesn't mean that we have to, I'm just openly, right? What, the question of why?
I think it's a remnant of sacrifice.
A remnant of sacrifice, okay?
Helps to focus.
Helps us to focus. Okay. Helps us to focus. Something that once upon a time, and a reminder, one might say, it helps us to focus. Why else? And by the way, just so that we know, right? Fasting is not, it's not the property of the Christian church, as you know, right? It's not the property of Judaism. It's not the property of Islam. And yet, it's in all of these, not surprisingly, what is called a monotheistic religion. But it's in other religions as well, as you all know. But why? Why fast? Because we do. Some, as you well know, one of the 5 pillars of Islam, right, is fasting. And certainly for the month of Ramadan, it is very structured in terms of in terms of when you begin and when you end and what it means. And it's an intriguing kind of thing because it's not a mandate, because if your health precludes you from doing that, there is an understanding. But for those who fast, the question, at least for me, is why?
Some people do it for health reasons.
Some people do for health reasons. To cleanse, right? Any other ideas?
Self-discipline.
Self-discipline. And of course, for some folks, as an aside, there's always, what am I going to give up for Lent? Right? And by the way, if you say, well, you know, I'm going to give up chocolate for Lent. As it turns out, you don't eat chocolate, that's not giving up anything. So it has to matter somehow. So fasting. So this is what the prophet says about fasting. Why do we fast? Why do we fast? But you do not see. Why humble yourselves, but you do not notice? And by the way, again, we're going to parse some of this. Okay? What is it? Literally, what's the word humble? We know this. Humble. For those of us who humble ourselves. And by the way, Jesus was very clear about this whole humbling thing, right? The idea of humbling yourself so that the world could see that you're humble is not real humility. Do not walk around with a sign that says, I'm number one in humility. That sort of. Okay. But we think of humble, the word itself, that has to do what? Literally meaning what? We know this. We just may not realize that we know this. But of course, it has to do with, you know, that thing for those of us who still mow with the grass lying under, as in humus, simrud. Okay, it's that which is down there. That's what it means to be humble. Which means it's not to elevate yourself. For those of us who fast, remember what Jesus talks about fasting as well. You know, don't pour oil on your head so someone says, "Oh, Alan, oh, how is it going?" And Alan says, "Well, you know, I'm just fasting." That is the reward that you will get right there. That someone will come and say, "Oh, that Alan, oh, he's fasting. I'm not looking great at it, by the way." But if that's the reward that you want by public acclamation, knock yourself up. But what does it mean to humble yourself and to fast? Which is what the prophet is getting at here. Okay. So why humble yourselves, but you do not notice? In other words, humility maybe forces us to focus on what's out there. Forces us to see the world in which we live. It forces us not to get recognition because we're, you know, walking around, you know, looking for pity, but forcing us to see the world in its need and suffering. But you do not notice, the prophet is saying. You're saying that you're humble, you're fasting, but it's all what? It's all about us. It's all about, maybe to put it in a somewhat uncharitable way, it's really quite self-indulgent, right? It's asking the world to focus on us. And he says, look, you have served your own interests on your fast day, and you oppress all your workers. Okay, again, let me take you back to when we were talking about Micah. Okay, and Micah, of course, comes before this section of the prophet Isaiah. And you remember the text from Micah that we discussed a couple weeks ago before Christmas, where Micah is all over the people by saying to them, you lie on your bed and you are thinking, even though it's a Sabbath, You're lying on your bed, and what are you doing? Instead of resting, conspicuously set aside for the Sabbath, or even much more human, it's set aside for rest. In fact, you're what? You're constructing in your head, how is it that I get more out of these people? So you are looking for ways to really take advantage of the community in which you're part rather than resting. Or literally sleeping. So even at a time when you should be resting, you're thinking, what can I do to get more? So, look, you fast only to quarrel and to fight, and to strike with a wicked fist. Such fasting as you do today will not make your voice heard on high. And it's striking, because if you fast, and you continue to quarrel, and you continue to fight, literally and figuratively, right? You might very well get recognition where you are. And if that's the recognition you seek, mazel tov. Okay? But you will not be heard on high, which is perhaps the recognition that we should associate with fasting and with humility, because that's where it matters. So, here are 3 significant rhetorical questions. Is such the fast that I choose a day to humble oneself? Remember now, the prophet is speaking on behalf of God. Is this the kind of fast that I choose? Is it to bow down the head like a bulrush and to lie in sackcloth and ashes? Will you call this a fast, a day acceptable to the Lord? Those are the questions that, I sort of wrap myself into sort of clothing with ashes over my head and maybe on my face. Remember, reminiscent of who? Of Job. Remember, reminiscent of Job. A time of deep mourning and grief and suffering, where in fact the world will see what's happening. Is that, and then, you get pity, right? Is that what I'm looking for? By the way, particularly when you're not suffering, but you're leading the world to think that you're suffering because, it's kind of woe me. Is this what I want from your fast? Is this what I want from your humility? And then the prophet goes on to say, is not this the fast that I choose to loose the bonds of injustice? And this is what I want to emphasize, among other things, about these prophets, right? They don't leave us saying, you're doomed. Nice seeing you, good talking with you, I'm gone. Okay? They don't leave us hanging there with a word that is absolutely devastating. That word is there, but invariably there is a path out. Elie Wiesel, you remember Elie Wiesel? Elie Wiesel. He was giving a graduation lecture to the students, the graduates at WashU, Washington University in St. Louis, several years ago. And he told them, as he often does, right? If you've never read him or heard him, he's a remarkable storyteller. He believes, as I do, that after all of the data has been said and done, it's the stories that change our lives. Okay? And he said, he told a story. He said, a man went out hiking. And in his hike in the woods, he took a path, and then all of a sudden he became disoriented, and he found himself lost in the woods. Okay? By the way, as you know, this happens in real life as well. Okay? And he was lost in the woods. And he started, of course, as you can imagine, taking different paths and just became more and more lost. And while he was there in a state of despair, lo and behold, someone else shows up in the area. And he says to the person, I'm so glad that you're here. I'm lost, you can show me how to get out. And the person said, I'm also lost. But here is what I can tell you. That road will not lead you out. And that road will not lead you out. Okay? And his point is this. Part of the role of the prophet, and in fact, I believe for us, is not only to say, I'm lost, throw your hands up, I'm done, right? It's also to say, I can tell you that that path there will not lead you to light. That path will not lead you to light. But here is what we need to discover. Here is what we need to try. And the prophets do not leave the people hanging with something that is so devastating. Even when they were in exile. Even when they were in exile, as we will discover. So the prophet Isaiah, who says, so here's what I want you to do. If you fast, right, let your fasting be connected with loosening the bonds of injustice. And if you're thinking, holy cow, where do I begin? Welcome. Okay? Because it's a challenge, isn't it? And then, by the way, if that were not enough, he says, you have to undo the thongs of the yoke and to let the oppressed go free. And you're sitting here and I'm standing here and we're all together saying, how in the world are we going to do that? But one of the things that you find with the prophets, the Hebrew prophets, they tell you what you need to do. But you have to go out and figure out how to do it. Okay? But there are contemporary American scholars who get frustrated and says, why can't they tell us how to do it? But they tell us what you need to do. Loosen the bonds of injustice. And you're saying, how do I do that? Figure it out. Okay? Let the oppressed go free. By the way, the only way that works is for us, first of all, to know who the oppressed are. That's the only way that works, right? And it acknowledges that we have to have some idea of who these folks are. You have to break every yoke. Break every yoke. Where do I begin with this? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry? I still believe that sharing a meal with another person who is not, a friend or a family member or even an acquaintance might very well be one of the most challenging and perhaps intimate things that could be done, right? And by the way, this is not me saying this. This is coming out of the biblical text and it's part of the teachings of Jesus. So, 2 examples. You remember the crowd that followed Jesus because they wanted to hear him preach? Remember that? He was trying to get away to have a little solitude. And they're following him. We're talking, remember, how many? 5,000, right? Which we know was more like what? Probably at least 15 to 20,000 because women and children were not counted. By the way, I know you're thinking I'm going to go and rewrite the Bible, but before you do that. And so you have thousands are following Jesus because they heard that he had a message. And finally, he stops, and what's the first thing he says? In the Gospel of Luke, He asked a question. Have they had something to eat? And of course, the disciples, being the disciples, wanted to do what?
Send them away.
That would be nothing. Okay? They wanted to just get rid of these people, and they simply want to say, just give them something. And Jesus would have none of it. And of course, they were all fed, they were all satisfied, and then you remember what he preached about? Trick question. He doesn't. He doesn't. The feeding of the hungry itself became the message. He doesn't. They came to hear the word and they got fed in a different way. That is what the prophet is talking about. Okay? Let me give you a second example that comes out of literature that I suspect we all know. You remember Dostoevsky, the brothers Karamazov, the novel that I know you read over Christmas. By the way, anyone who tells me that they've been sitting around reading the Brothers Karamazov or War and Peace over Christmas, right? Come see me and I will tell you how to get a life. But in there's a character by the name of Madame Hoholahov. And Madame Hoholahov goes to her priest, Father Susina, and says, I want to serve humanity. By the way, don't you love it? Who doesn't want to serve humanity? Well, actually, I know there are a few in government, but who doesn't want to serve humanity? Right? But think about it. That is so wide-ranging, right? The serving of humanity has never been the issue. What's been the issue? It's the caring for the human being. That's been the issue. Caring about hunger has never really been the issue. It's actually feeding the hungry that's been the challenge. And so the priest tells her a story. And the story is about a person who wanted to serve humanity. And the priest says, the first thing that you need to do is to sit across from your table and share a meal with another person, a stranger. And he says, as he tells her the story, he says, the person decides to do that, and within minutes, begin criticizing the person across the table. Okay? That they're chewing with their mouth open, and the whole works. Right? And his point is this. It's easy for us to say, I want to serve humanity. It's much more difficult to have a meal with a stranger. Much more difficult. And some might argue, if you do, genuinely, not for a photo op, but genuinely, maybe while the world is not looking, maybe then we begin to understand what it means to fast and to be humble. This is what the prophet is saying. It has to be something along those lines. Is it not to share your bread with the hungry? Is it not to bring the homeless poor into your house? Let's be very clear. You know the example that Pastor Dave gave this morning with Kirk, I almost said Kirk Cousins, but Kirk Douglas? I mean, do we stop for hitchhikers? How society has transformed, right? Where the compelling act right now is generated by what? Fear. And maybe a generation or two ago that was not the case. So bringing a homeless person into your house? When you see the naked person, to cover them? And we don't want to talk about nakedness here as purely as a literal thing. But someone, again, think of the prophet, right? We talked about this in the early part of the book of Isaiah, where the wealthy landowners were taking the land from those who had to borrow, to survive. And when they couldn't pay, they end up taking everything, including what? The coat. So this idea of clothing the naked is not some kind of hyperbole here. It could be literal, but it's the metaphor, it's the figurative language. You have to care for those who have been stripped bare. And that's the issue. How do we do that? Not to hide yourself from your own kin. And for some folks that might get close for comfort, that, I'm glad Thanksgiving and Christmas are over. I guess I'll see them again next year. Remember the study that came out a few years ago? It was about Thanksgiving, that families are getting together, and by noon, half of the family wants to go to the movie theater because they can't stand being at home with the rest of the family. And then the prophet says, then your light shall break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up quickly. Your vindicator shall go before you. The glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. Then you shall call, and the Lord will answer, and you shall cry, and he will say, here I am. And I will look at this in a moment, because particularly in the case of Jeremiah, we will see something that scholars have written about and discussed, which is called the if-then formula. If you do this, then, right? I have to say, personally, every time I come across that, I worry a little bit. It's kind of like, because I think it's fraught with some difficulties, that says, if you do this for me, then, right? It sounds what? Vaguely like what?
It's a contract.
Think of the Latin that's been in the news of the Latin.
Quid pro quo.
Quid pro quo, right? You do this for me, then I will do this for you. Okay? In the more common parlance, you scratch my back? Right. Okay? And this is not what the prophet is saying. We want to be clear. This is not quid pro quo. This is that if you and I are going to have a relationship, right? Here are expectations, and on the basis of those, we will continue. So here is, by the way, this is the answer here. Not only to fasting, but to the relationship. If we're going to have that, then this must be done. And it ends on this wonderful note that says, when this all happens, the Lord will say what? Here I am. Okay? And in a way, it comes full circle. Why? Because if you go back, we won't right now, but if you go back and read the early part of the book of Isaiah, when Isaiah is called, what was his response? Remember, famously, here I am, send me, right? Which is a remarkable thing. If you want, and by the way, again, we don't want to spend too much time, but before I do that, let me put it this way. The bottom here, which you don't have to memorize or anything, but the bottom there, which is Yahweh, or in Hebrew, okay, the top, the 4 letters, we put the vowels in, but it never does you will never find in the Hebrew ever the name Yahweh with vowels. It's one of the rare things, right? Even when vowels are added to other things, this name remains without vocalization. But it's based on the verb. You know this. Remember Moses saying, "Who shall I send?" Okay? Tell the people that, who sent you? I am. All right? The name is based on the Hebrew verb to be. So you can see it's a play on the name. That's why the name could be I am, I was, or I will be, right? And it's because it's based on the verb to be. So when it says here I am, in a way, you're saying here is God, Yahweh. Let me pause there because we're gonna shift gears a little bit here. And I always feel a little sheepish because, of course, there's so much more in the prophet Isaiah that we haven't touched upon, right? And unless we have the freedom in time simply to focus an adult forum on Genesis 1 to 11, which will take a year, keep moving. But I want to shift gears to our friend Jeremiah. Okay. Yesterday, Vera and I were sitting in the study and looking at Jeopardy, and always imagining how many of these things, by the way, in our own time we could ever get right. And I emphasize in our own time because it doesn't work that way in our own time. But one of the questions at the final Jeopardy question was, in a sermon by a New England preacher, which Old Testament prophet did he mention? That was the final Jeopardy question. And I always worry about these things because I feel at that moment you mentioned Old Testament in Jeopardy, I should have an idea of what's going on here. And I had no idea what it was. I absolutely had no idea. So I was saying to Grace, I read Jeremiah. I really have no idea. And it turns out, which by the way I think it was kind of a nutty comparison, but it turns out that he was referencing Jonah because he was discussing something about whaling. So I'm thinking, okay, you're discussing whaling, so naturally Jonah comes to mind. I didn't feel as badly because one of the contestants said famously, Joseph. And I thought, okay. It was a J thing. All right. So Jeremiah chapter 7. And I want to place Jeremiah in this context. As I said, he is a rare prophet, unique, in the sense that he lived to see his words. And he never abandoned his people. He never abandoned his people. But also, he is the prophet that at least in some quarters you hear folks quoting. Whether or not they realize they're quoting Jeremiah is a whole different story. Because a lot of folks who quote the Bible have no idea what the context is. Let's be very clear about it. Okay? But folks would say, before I knew you, what happened? I formed you in your mother's womb. Right? Where does that come from? Jeremiah. Okay, it's from Jeremiah. So one might say, of all the prophets who might not have had a choice, Jeremiah did. So as Jeremiah begins, here's what he says. The word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord. Okay, and you see a couple of ellipses in here. Amend your ways and your doings, and let me dwell with you in this place. Do not trust in these deceptive words. By the way, I place this up here in part because this is not me repeating this for emphasis. This is in the text. Jeremiah is saying to the people, you cannot keep saying this is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, as if by repeating that, right, that's all that matters. It is more than that. You cannot keep repeating that. In fact, you have to amend your ways. And here is where we get the if-then, right? And it goes like this. If you truly amend your ways and your doings, if you truly act justly, and I want to emphasize this, because the idea here, you notice that word? The verb here is what? Act, act, act. There are two things here. You must act, and the adverb is, of course, justly. You have to act justly. But then flip that aside, right? Your actions have to be just. But justice has to be what? Done. It is something that has to be acted upon, right? You can't just say, you know, I love humanity. Okay? That's not enough. Okay? You cannot say, well, you know, I believe in liberty and justice for all, and standing on a table while you pronounce that as if somehow that will bring it about by itself. No. Act. You have to act. And here's what the prophet is saying. If you really want this relationship to continue, if you want this to make a difference, act justly. One with another. And I love this because it's difficult. And I want to say, at least somewhat as an aside, the things that matter most of all in our lives invariably come with an element of difficulty. Remember the title of one of my favorite writers, German writers, Rainer Maria Rilke, okay, 19th century. Maybe he's most well known for a small book that is called Letters to a Young Poet. Okay, it's very tiny. You read it in an hour or so. But he also wrote a book that's called, pardon me, Love and Other Difficulties. Okay? The things that matter, because we have to work at it, because we have to tend it, because we have to nurture it, because it takes effort, it takes time, it takes commitment, it takes energy, it takes who we are. And it says here, okay, one another, act justly with one another. With one another, very specifically and individual. I'm very happy that we all love humanity. But I want you to love one another. I want you to love the other human being. You know, the one that you would rather not have a meal with, that one. And then it goes on. And then if you do not oppress the alien, by the way, the word alien here is, I'll put it this way. We don't have to know the Hebrew here. It's a word that's pronounced ger. And that might not ring a bell. But maybe this will. Or at least in a quiz question for you. The son of Moses is named Gershom. Okay? It's named, and it's made up of two Hebrew words, Ger and Shem. And the Hebrew Shem, of course, means name. Okay? So, for example, if Alan and I are two Jewish men talking about God, and because we are religious folks and we take that name seriously, we would never mention God or Yahweh. Every time we want to, we would say what? It sounds, we would refer to it as Hashem. Okay? And Hashem simply means the name. So when we're talking about God and we want to refer to the Lord or we want to refer to God, we never say that, we say Hashem. Okay? And by the way, this is not some ancient idea. This is now. This is the way it is now. Gershom is, my name is Sojourner. He named his son. The name is Sojourner. Okay, so when we think of alien here, pause for a second and get it out of the political realm here. Okay, Sojourner. Okay, to take and care for the one who is in our midst, maybe not permanently, but at the very least for a while. It could be for a day or two, a week, or in some instances, 40 years. As was the case with Moses. Okay, so if you do not oppress the alien, if you do not oppress the orphan and the widow, or shed innocent blood in this place, if you do not go after other gods to your own hurt, then, look at all of the ifs. If you don't do this, if you don't do this, if you don't do this, then, as they say, let's talk. Then we can have a relationship. And we want to be careful, again, this is not a quid pro quo. This is not sometimes, you and I are partners here. You do for me, I do for you. We're both leaders, we're both prime ministers, we're both presidents, we're both, take your pick. Keep in mind, this is, of course, God and the people. There is a relationship, but this is not equal here. So it's not quid pro quo. But these are things to maintain. And how we care for one another, how we love one another, and then you can flesh that out, will reflect how our relationship between God and us will be. We cannot say, for example, the prophet would say, Jesus would say, we cannot say we love God, but hate our neighbor. Or the sojourner. Or the orphan. And you notice all of these groups, economically, socially, where are they? Right at the bottom. The orphan, the widow, the sojourner, the oppressed, the hungry. Then I will dwell with you in this place, in the land that I gave of old to your ancestors forever and ever. And here's the thing. God has promised, the prophet is saying, that the land has been given to your ancestors into perpetuity, right? You have this is yours into perpetuity. But then what do? You cannot simply go and barricade yourself in the temple by saying, this is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, you can't touch us here. And oh, by the way, we have the land because you promised to give it to us in perpetuity, and therefore that's the end of it. No. No. Yes, you will have the land into perpetuity, but you must live in relationship with each other, particularly those who do not have anyone else to care for them. And therein lies the challenge. Here you are trusting in these deceptive words to no avail. You cannot simply say, I'm religious. Remember what the prophet Amos said? It doesn't matter if you're going to Gilgal and Bethel twice a week, and tithing twice a week, and giving offerings. I do not, remember? It says, I hate your appointed feasts. My soul hates your appointed feasts. Remember that was my assignment to you 3 weeks ago? do an artistic rendering of the soul. But this is the soul of God. As if it's not enough for us to figure out what the human soul is. The soul of God is saying, I hate what you're doing. So the issue here, by the way, let's be very clear before I wrap this up here. The issue here is neither whether you should go to church. Please do not leave this room or rooms and said, well, Hentai was saying, you know, this whole church thing, regularity is not good. The issue is, what difference does it make? That's the issue. That is the question. So you go and you do all of these things, and then you come and you stand before me, and you call me by my name, and you say, we're safe. We're safe. Never mind everything else that we have done or not done. We're safe. And the Prophet says, you're not, unless you do these things. All right. Let's stop there because we have to. And we will pick up with our friend Jeremiah. And we will, by the way, get to Jonah. We will get to Jonah. Not for the wailing, but we will get to Jonah. And I'm told that for the course of January, we'll be meeting in this room. All right. So see you next Sunday, everyone. But only a little bit.
I think it was 2 weeks.